Um, Hello, everyone. So my name is Pádraig Finnerty, and I'm the president of the Emily Dickinson International Society, and I'm also the person who organizes our research community. So this is one of our four communities, as well as pedagogy, translation, and and art. Sorry. Um, so today, the title of our event is "Forever is Composed of Nows," and it's a celebration of EDIS awards and fellowships, and it's also celebrating Emily Dickinson's birthday. And we're going to hear from two of our recent winners, Vladislav Areshka, who received a fellowship in 2024, and Beverley Catlett Bolen, who received a fellowship in 2025. So before we turn to hear about their work and what the fellowships have enabled, I'd like to turn to Elizabeth Petrino, who's the chair of our awards committee, and she's going to now launch the awards for 2026. So if I could turn to Elizabeth when you're ready.
Yeah, thank you, Park, and welcome everyone. Congratulations to our award winners. I'm Elizabeth Petrino. I chair the EDIS Awards Committee. And on behalf of our committee, Marta Werner, Patrick Morgan, Cheryl Weaver, and I'd like to thank everyone here for coming. And I also would like to encourage you to apply for our awards. One of our major activities is to encourage and support scholarship and creative work on Dickinson worldwide. And for that reason, the EDIS board supports several awards to recognize excellence and encourage scholars and students in our field. And so today, as Park said, in honor of Emily Dickinson's birthday, I'd like to mention two of those awards that we're very excited to launch. So first, as you may know, we sponsor a prize for undergraduate work on Emily Dickinson, created for an undergraduate course. So students working on any aspect of Dickinson are encouraged to submit. The committee especially encourages discussion of current compelling debates within literary studies, especially as related to race, gender, class, sexuality, and disability studies. We're also very happy to receive any experimental work that you're doing in different media. Our committee also is committed to providing feedback to highly ranked submissions, and the winner will receive a small cash prize and will have their abstract or short selection of their work posted on the website. So for those of you who are faculty, we encourage you to look for and recognize your students' work. And to do that, we ask that you send us that student's work with a cover page that lists the student's contact information. And we ask also for a short recommendation or contextualization of the assignment. The details of this are on the website, so please look for them there, but you can send them to me. And the deadline for submitting for the undergraduate award is June 30th of 2026. So please mark your calendar. The second award we give is we sponsor a $1,000 fellowship for graduate students in support of their work and its scholarly excellence. And of course, our two contributors today both were winners of that award. So graduate students working on any aspect of Dickinson are encouraged to submit. Again, a few points. The project does not need to be devoted solely to Emily Dickinson, though her work should be a substantial focus. We also encourage international applications and applications from students in the US. Both are welcome. The award can be used for any expense incurred to advance the project. So that includes travel to collections as well as time spent writing. And the preference we give will be to students working in the dissertation stage or writing work that's aimed at peer-reviewed publication, either in digital or print form. So please keep that in mind. And again, details are on the website. We encourage you to submit a CV, a cover letter, a description of the project, a bibliography, and then contact information for 2 references. Again, you can send those to me, and my email is epetrino@fairfield.edu. This is also on the website as well, on the awards page. The deadline for submitting there is March 15th, 2026. So again, I encourage you, if you have any questions, if you're wondering about how to submit or anything about where you are currently in your research program, please feel free to write to me or any of the members of the committee. I can certainly answer questions or consult with others who can. Again, at epetrino@fairfield.edu. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them, but otherwise, please feel free to be in touch. And we encourage you to submit because we'd like to recognize your work.
And thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was brilliant. And please do apply for our fellowships. So we'll start off with Vladislav Areshka's talk. And just to mention that he was a PhD student from University of Portsmouth. He now has his PhD. And his article, Hearing New Englandly Emily Dickinson's Rhymes, was published in the New England Quarterly. And I'm really excited to hear his presentation. And after Vladislav, we'll have Beverley's presentation, and I'll introduce her, and then we'll have some questions and answers after their presentations. So over to you, Vladislav.
Good day, everyone. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for acknowledging my work with the fellowship, and also congratulations to Beverley too. And happy Emily Dickinson's birthday week to everyone. So, and also you're very kind to connect today. I'd like to start, and if I may share my presentation, if it's not a problem. Okay. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The title of my work, the general title of my research is Emily Dickinson's Original New England Pronunciation. And I'd like to start by framing your expectations a bit. I will introduce my presentation describing the essence of my research, its hows and whys, and also how the precious contribution of the EDIS award allowed me to develop my research even further. And also what I wanted today to dwell on as well is the series of subsidiary deliberations on how our critical approach to reading and apprehending Dickinson should change if we want to see and hear the true poet. So my research is occupied with giving the mute figure of Emily Dickinson her voice back. I try to understand what Dickinson's individual accent was, and discovering that we have a wonderful opportunity of learning more about how the poet's pronunciation, with which she dissected each word in her mind to create the best melody possible, must have directed her poetic choices. So practically, this is a commingling of historical linguistics and historical poetics, and that is uncovering how language, poetry, and their perception changed throughout history, throughout time. So each time I visualize these areas of study as a literary historian undressing from their modern garments, like jeans and pajamas or whatever they staying comfortably writing scholarly articles, stepping away from the computer, putting on a frock coat and a pompous skirt and a brocade bodice, and survive Springfield Weekly Republican from 1864 to read on a Sunday morning before leaving for church. And all this they do to understand what a 19th century poet would feel and think as driven by the historical context, including their material culture, environment, weather, and so on. But apart from differences in fashion and technology, what I insist is important is that to be accounted for are the differences in the language of the 19th century Amherst as compared to our modern days. So usually when approaching a text historically, a reader thinks of lexical and semantic related to meaning differences, of how people use different words for the same phenomenon, or they used the same word but in a different, now outdated sense, as the use of the word gay, for example, or even now rare sense of transport, meaning the state of being carried away with a feeling, as we can see in several of Nature's people I know, and they know me. I feel for them a transport of cordiality. Or when we approach Dickinson's language historically, we have another apparent idiosyncrasy, a visual one, observed in her spelling. For example, we have frequently in Emily Dickinson's writings, woe for woe without an E, or upon commencing with an O instead of usual U. But my historical linguistic research deals with a problem that has been largely overlooked in Dickinson's studies. I mean the invisible world of sound, of words, their pronunciation. And so we can imagine our literary historian should not only change their dresses and exercise in penmanship, but our literary historian needs to learn a new language which had a very different pronunciation in order to understand Dickinson as completely as they possibly can. For instance, most New Englanders did not pronounce their R's, and the words like morning or beer, they would utter morning or beer, like a stereotypical Boston accent of park your car in the Harvard Yard. And today people from northern states may most likely remember their parents and grandparents speaking like that. For Dickinson, it meant, for example, that in the stanza, put up my lute, what of my music, since the sole ear I care to charm, passive as granite laps my music, sobbing will suit as well as psalm. The poet must have intended the words charm and psalm to be a perfect rhyme rather than an approximate rhyme, as it is in the 21st century American English. So charm and psalm instead of charm and psalm. And some even pronounce today the word psalm as psalm, according to Merriam-Webster dictionary, so granting an even stranger rhyme. But anyway, it is not so rare to hear someone in the US today also drop their R's, but I discovered that many 19th century Yankees were also prone to pronounce the sound, the short sound E, as in pin, closest to the sound of E, like pen. And this local pronunciation can, for example, very much explain the rhyme in the second stanza of the same poem. Would buds and Memnon of the desert teach me the strain that vanquished him when he surrendered to the sunrise, maybe that would awaken them. If we sum the two words with some general American accent, we have him and them that do not rhyme perfectly. But if we take an account of the historical New England accent, the rhyme clicks, becoming him and them. And this research practically addresses two important questions. How could we know that we were the 19th century? How could we know what were the 19th century pronunciations, and in which way may we know what were Dickinson's pronunciations? So in the period when no audio recordings were available, we have to rely on the assessment of a wide range of written records. And these records include direct linguistic sources such as spelling books, dictionaries, or occasional writings of the time on local accents. And these prescriptive sources explicitly describe how the sounds should be pronounced, even including positions of vocal organs to produce the sounds. And they also reflect what was considered a standard pronunciation at one time or another. So, for example, none other than Dickinson's lexicon, her personal 1844 edition of Noah Webster's dictionary, has a dedicated and very detailed section on pronunciation of vowels and consonants. So the dictionary, for example, attributes the first sound of A as in pain to the category, and let me write it down, as in pain, to the category of a perfect vowel whose sound may be prolonged at pleasure without altering the position of the organs, meaning the lack of a glide after the sound E. And the word like pain should be actually sounded similar to prolonged E, as in pen, according to this linguistic authority. So a totally different pronunciation compared to what we expect during our modern reading. But at any given time and place, not just one, but many accents pervade the streets and houses of Amherst. So how can we be actually sure that Dickinson would really pronounce him as ham to rhyme with them instead of just having voluntarily used slant rhyme? And unfortunately, we do not have direct commentary from the poet herself. But we have multiple clues that we can combine and deduce which sound among the many occurrent in New England Dickinson would use in her case. So the poet's rhymes are one of such clues. Another important one is non-standard orthography or misspellings that would represent phonetic spelling of a word, writing a word based on how it sounded to a person. So during my research, I scoured Dickinson's letters and poems for peculiar spellings. And for example, we can be even more sure that she had this non-rhotic pronunciation, that she dropped her R's, not only because in New England, almost everyone dropped the R's, as in charm, but because Dickinson herself used such phonetic spellings as mom, marm for ma'am. For example, in the letter to Austin Dickinson, her brother, she wrote, "He asked me tonight if I had a newspaper. Why, said I. Pat, can you read? Yes, ma'am, he answered." So where the open Italian R sound, like R, today transcribed as AH, was frequently transcribed in New England in the way of having A and R, like marm. And if you may remember, we have, for example, a similar appellative in Little Women of having marmy written with M-A-R-M-E-E, which is not sounded at all as marmy, and the way they did in the 2019 movie. But we have the exactly same phenomenon in Emily Dickinson of just transcribing a particular sound, more open sound with an R, which gives such a different tone to the A preceding the consonant. And so anyway, evidence like this is the most valuable in reconstructing one's person's individual dialect or idialect. And this is where the EDIS award came in really handy, because the award allowed me to access Dickinson family papers at the Houghton Library and make digital copies of the family papers. Among others, these include Emily's mother's letters, or her aunts and grandmothers, Edward Dickinson's writings, or Bayreuth's letters, and so on. And men are much less interesting, actually, as subjects of such orthographic research than their female counterparts, and this must be due to their pretty solid education at the time and very regular grammar habits. But women, on the contrary, similar to Emily Dickinson, have great, let's say, variety spelling-wise. And this is why it is very interesting to find the clues of their phonetic spellings that may expand our knowledge of what a particular person, and Emily Dickinson in particular, pronounced in her turn. And this is still a work in progress, because such linguistic analysis requires careful transcribing, triple checking the manuscripts, and then finally analyzing them. But for example, I have no idea what I should do with Austin Dickinson, who wrote like this in his best days. And after this, people complain about poor Emily Dickinson and her writing. However, I have been able to analyze and include in my PhD research some of Dickinson's mother's, Emily Dickinson's writings, and discover several not occasional misspellings that very much strengthened my theories about how certain vowels must have sounded around Dickinson. What I mean is that, for example, Mrs. Dickinson's spelling of "fallings" for feelings in one of her courtship letters to Edward Dickinson is a quasi-transcription of how Dickinson should have intended to form the rhyme "cells feels" in the stanza, "the lancer stirless must descend among the cunning cells, and touch the pantomime himself, how numb the bellows feels." And obviously we have a better correlation between two rhyming words if we pronounce them in this more 19th century New England way, having cells and fells. Or she wrote, Emily Norcross Dickinson wrote, a pad for appeared, whose sound phonemically amalgamates disappeared and fad in Dickinson's conferring from myself. And I expect that by listening to previous examples, you may also withhold a very much appropriate remark. Does it matter that we pronounce Dickinson's words with our modern accents? Or shall we adapt to a different accent to read in what may seem appropriate way her poems? And what my research showed and what I insist on in it is that, yes, very much so. The problem with the poet's legacy is that one frequently speaks of irregularities, but actually to assess those Dickinson's irregularities, we need to have a pretty good idea of what was normal for Dickinson in her specific historical and literary context. So take, for example, her famous odd rhymes, and if we pronounce them in a historically accurate way, they are no longer slant, but fully flashed, perfect rhymes. So like disappeared, fed. And in terms of rhyming, this transforms Dickinson from a transgressor to a more traditional poet, relying on full rhymes. But also our ideas about conventions in the 19th century literature are incomplete without proper comparative analysis. So how other poets of the time rhymed. And another fact my research made me notice is that the commonplace idea about peculiarity of Dickinson in her literary context is frequently based on the critics' perspectives that wanted to accommodate this idea of Dickinson's uniqueness into their argument, rather than analyzing and doubting it. So I wanted to underline how in Dickinson's studies, appropriate methods of comparative analysis make significant differences. For example, listen to this poem. Faith of the summer night, a myth in velvet dust, frail devotee of light, shivering in idle quest. So we have dust, quest, slant rhyme, far from a perfect rhyme, but actually this is not a Dickinson's poem. It belongs to her sister-in-law, Susan Dickinson. So how can we be sure to say that Dickinson was innovative in rhyming, for example, when thousands of other examples of identical to Dickinson's slant rhymes can be found in the poems by her contemporaries? Because, by the way, Emily Dickinson also sounded similar to similar words like dust and quest. And one of the most, for example, one of the most popular poets in the 19th century America, John Greenleaf Whittier from Massachusetts, on several occasions excused himself in his letters about his good Yankee rhymes. For example, martyr, water, or pasture, faster. That seemed false to the speakers of other dialects, but himself they were completely normal. And Thomas Higginson himself, a distinguished man of letters and acclaimed traditionalist, admitted such regional rhymes in Whittier, calling them the localisms, and himself was the one to rhyme morning with dawning, which was not very much accepted in the 19th century US, this fact of dropping their R's. So he was transgressive in his own way. And I would say this is enough evidence for primary sources as such to doubt this validity of the critical conventions that Dickinson's rhyming was necessarily irregular and strange, because it just depends on the perspective and who we compare her with. And what it means is that before drawing any conclusion, any really founded conclusion about her poetic craft, we need to hear the way she heard or spoke her poetry. And my research into Dickinson's sound, along with this idea of the right perspective to approach her texts, makes a case about how criticism and editors should also deal with her orthography. For instance, Kristen Miller described her methodology of treating so-called misspellings in the introduction of the 2016 edition of Dickinson's poems in the following manner. I also correct a few words she typically misspelled in all genres, February and upon, and a few she used rarely in poetry, such as apparelled, mattress, perennial, because they seem to me that to have no significance beyond pointing to the poet's indifferent spelling. And the point is that these words actually hold significance. If we approach them from a historical perspective, many misspellings were still regular spellings for Dickinson's generation, or at least that of her parents. And we can find books that published still with these spellings, like upon with an O. And in the least, these spellings could have had affectionate value for Dickinson, if not being completely normal to anyone around her. So if we approach, and moreover, if we approach Dickinson's orthography from the historical acoustic perspective, many of her spellings are actually explained by her sound. So for example, February, spelled February, represents her pronunciation without a middle R, the pronunciation which was common at her time and which is pretty much happening even today. And such words as bouquet, bouquet instead of bouquet, written without an additional U, also hold the key to understanding how Dickinson would sound a particular word. And after careful analysis of 1850s habits of writing, we actually can explore that in other publications, it was pretty common to not only to write in personal writings, like in manuscripts and letters and journals, the word bouquet with just a no sounding bouquet, but it was also common to publish in reputable journals to use this non-standard spelling instead of the usual one. So I think for any editor, including these different spellings, the way Dickinson registered them provides to a reader an oral key to understanding how Dickinson would recite a poem or hear her own letters, preserving her distinctive orthography rather than trying to normalize it means preserving her sound in future texts. So because again, if you think, what is normal? And does everyone have or did have the same normal? Our jobs, I think, as researchers, is to be careful about remembering to approach Dickinson from her own historical perspective, rather than trying to judge herself from our own modern perspective. And to conclude, I would like to say that I'm proceeding with this research after completing my PhD this April. And I reconstruct 19th century New England pronunciation, and I'm creating a digital pronunciation dictionary which will include also sample recordings of several thousand of words that would allow everyone hear Dickinson and actually other New Englanders the way she meant to be heard, and also make accessible this invisible, elusive acoustic knowledge to everyone, thus opening new avenues of studying prosody, poetics, historical criticism, and translation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vladislav. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. We'll save questions for a second, until after our next talk. So Vladislav was the winner of our 2024 EDIS Graduate Student Fellowship. And I'm going to turn to Beverley Catlett Bolen, who is the winner of our fellowship for 2025. Beverley is a PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill, where she specializes in 19th century American literature and the environmental humanities, and her dissertation is entitled Water in the Theological History of Science, Emerson, Dickinson, and Whitman. So whenever you're ready, Beverley, we're looking forward to hearing your talk.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so I will just be giving I'll be reading an excerpt from that Dickinson chapter of my dissertation this morning, and then I'll talk a little bit at the end, a little more about what I did during the fellowship period. But basically, I used the fellowship for some summer funding to complete this first chapter of my dissertation. It's on Dickinson, Edward Hitchcock, and Noah's flood in 19th century geology. And I'm looking at how Dickinson was schooled in geology during a time when natural theologians were using the flood to kind of reconcile science and religion, but how by the time she began writing her poems, that had turned into a conflict between science and theology. So basically, the chapter looks at how her flood poems reflect this transition from an alliance to an antagonism between science and theology that occurred around late 1850s, 1860s. But here's the excerpt from that chapter. It's from the introduction, and the chapter is called Flood Subjects, Dickinson and the Deluge. So in this chapter, I examine the ways in which Emily Dickinson revises the legend of Noah's flood to register contemporary conflicts between science and religion. Throughout, I trace Dickinson's poetic engagements with catastrophist diluvial theory, an apologist natural theological subtradition that reconciled Genesis, geology, and human exceptionalism through the discourse of Noah's flood. I place Dickinson's flood poems in direct conversation with the writings of her former Amherst professor, geologist Edward Hitchcock, America's leading proponent of diluvial theory, who leveraged the flood to reconcile what he called the apparent discrepancies between geology and revelation. Prior to catastrophism's emergence, geology became the first science to threaten American Protestantism when the discovery of deep time contradicted biblical chronology. The fossil record, meanwhile, undermined the idea of human special creation by revealing our apparent insignificance within the scheme of the pre-human past. Until 1860, however, geology's threats to biblical literalism and anthropocentrism remained unrealized due to the scriptural geology of catastrophism. Catastrophists maintain that over the course of deep time, God had introduced several successive varieties of species to the Earth's surface, and subsequently voided them therefrom, by means of catastrophic natural phenomena, namely floods and earthquakes of biblical proportions, that constituted divinely willed mass extinction events, each ushering in new and increasingly perfect forms of life. Noah's flood and the creation discussed in Genesis were merely the most recent of such events, and concerned the inception of all species currently in existence, which, in keeping with biblical chronology, had emerged just 5,000 or 6,000 years ago at the time of the deluge. With this progressionist narrative of the Earth's deep past, catastrophism harmonized the Bible with the fossil record while marginalizing the emergent idea of evolution. As a result, catastrophism was readily embraced in mid-century America, where it prevailed as the predominant scientific paradigm from the 1820s through the mid-1850s. During these years, Charles Lyell's secularized uniformitarian geology remained marginalized due to his insistence that in order to establish geology as a legitimate scientific discipline, we must free the science from Moses and from arguments for a geological flood. By the late 1850s, however, catastrophists' anti-evolutionary stance became incompatible with an increasingly sophisticated fossil record. Thereafter, Americans would have to accept a uniformitarian explanation for geological and biological change, which rendered evolution inevitable while dismantling the idea of God's immediate control over the course of natural history. Thus, catastrophism's collapse foregrounded a crisis that reached its apex with Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which cemented the downfall of natural theology altogether, while facilitating the secularization of postbellum American science. Yet the apologist power of the flood would not soon be forgotten for Emily Dickinson. Though Dickinson wrote the majority of her flood poems in the aftermath of catastrophism's collapse, she was schooled during the movement's peak under Hitchcock, a professor of geology and natural theology at Amherst, where Dickinson took geology courses during catastrophism's watershed as the ruling scientific paradigm in mid-century America. Throughout this discussion, I analyzed Dickinson's flood poems through the lens of the mid-century conflict between the religious science of natural theology which characterized her formal education in geology, and the irreligious science of Lyell and Darwin, which informed her adult struggle with religious doubt. During the years of Dickinson's scientific education, Noah's flood became symptomatic of this conflict through the catastrophist uniformitarian debate between religious and irreligious geology. Yet by the time she began writing her poems, the flood had become a symbolic casualty of this conflict, which escalated to a point of crisis and ultimate collapse with the publication of Darwin's Origin and the demise of Protestant natural theology. Dickinson's poetic career commenced on the very brink of this 1860 paradigm shift. By the time that she began writing her poems, Darwin and Lyell had effectively invalidated the catastrophist premises that underpinned her formal scientific education. Nonetheless, she proceeded to compose dozens of flood poems over the course of her career, which are consistently characterized by expressions of scientifically informed religious doubt. She also alludes to the deluge throughout her letters, where she describes her struggle for belief in immortality as the flood subject. Within these writings, Dickinson engages at length with disproven arguments for the geological flood, reviving scientific debates that were definitively settled in 1860, despite the fact that she was well aware of catastrophism's collapse and uniformitarianism's triumph, and that she recognized the Old Testament as largely fictitious. Why, then, does the flood retain such a pervasive presence throughout Dickinson's verse? I suggest that Dickinson converts the flood, which she originally encountered as a signifier of belief, into a vehicle for the expression of scientifically informed religious doubt. As Ed Folsom and Kenneth Price have observed, Dickinson often converts select phrases into vortex words or historically contingent metaphors that organize and abbreviate broader cultural context. These culturally charged phrases and images can indicate an entire structure of meaning that permeates a poem and function to encode the poems in which they occur as meditations on specific historical contexts. I argue that Dickinson's flood functions as a vortex metaphor or historically charged signifier that constellates the theological consequences of the 1860 paradigm shift away from the religious science of natural theology and towards the irreligious science of Lyell and Darwin, which undermined biblical history and eschatology while making it possible to dispense with God and organic nature. As the signifier of this 1860 scientific revolution, Dickinson's flood functions as a discursive nexus that registers and distills three key contexts and complications of post-1860 religious life, including the epistemological consequences of natural theology's collapse, the implications of irreligious science for views of planetary history, and declining faith in the flood subject of immortality. Whereas scholars interested in Dickinson's vortex words tend to focus on singular phrases, as in Folsom and Price's treatment of Domingo, I take a broader approach to Dickinson's diluvial poems, where the flood functions interchangeably with various other explicit phrases and images derived from Hitchcock or the Bible. Furthermore, I define a flood poem not necessarily as any poem that uses one of these phrases, but as a poem that leverages the flood to negotiate the spiritual and epistemological crisis instigated by the 1860 scientific revolution. Thus, I define Dickinson's flood not necessarily as a vortex word, but more precisely as a vortex metaphor that underpins poems concerned with the aforementioned three contexts of natural theology's collapse, the rise of irreligious science, and declining faith in biblical eschatology. Given her catastrophist education and contemporary scientific context, I suggest that the flood became more or less synonymous with each of these three developments within Dickinson's lexicon. Thus, Dickinson enlists the flood to encode her poems as meditations upon these developments and to contextualize the doubt that she expresses as a byproduct of the changing relationship between science and religion. To proceed, I group Dickinson's flood poems into three distinct categories, each corresponding to one of the aforementioned three contexts, to demonstrate the extent to which each of these developments informed her lifelong struggle with religious doubt. First, I turn to poems that register the recent collapse of Protestant natural theology. As the centerpiece of Hitchcock's endeavor to reconcile Genesis and geology, the flood would have acquired immense symbolic significance for Dickinson as a relic of Protestants' failed experiment to devise a scientific theology that would prove God's existence and biblical promises. In the poems The Voice That Stands for Floods and Morning Means Milking to the Farmer, Dickinson confronts the consequences of natural theology's collapse for personal faith, contemporary culture, and views of the natural world. As a vortex metaphor linked to Hitchcock's failed religious science, the flood indicates an entire structure of meaning that permeates these poems and that pivots on what Dickinson perceived as the most pressing consequences of the movement's demise, including the decentering of a faith unmoored from scientific evidence, the evacuation of nature's spiritual significance, and a sense of disillusion at the comparatively vapid cultural concerns, such as finance, that have eclipsed spirituality in the aftermath of the Darwinian Revolution. Within these poems, the flood functions as a retrospective figuration that evokes a bygone era in which natural theology suffused both nature and culture with profound religious meaning, while guaranteeing the productive synthesis of science and religion. Yet if these poems briefly address natural theology's past successes, they do so in terms inextricable from its recent failures. By alluding to the flood's obsolete apologist functions, Dickinson gestures to an outdated scientific past, while simultaneously confronting the present instabilities of a religion newly unmoored from science and the natural world. In the second group of flood poems that I examined, Dickinson confronts the implications of irreligious science for views of planetary history. After all, as a metaphor for the 1860s scientific revolution, the flood not only signifies natural theology's failures, it also gestures to the 1860 triumph of the naturalistic uniformitarian science of Lyell and Darwin. At the outset of Dickinson's poetic career, uniformitarians had invalidated the catastrophist flood while reconceptualizing natural history in terms independent of divine intervention. During the years of Dickinson's scientific education, catastrophists maintained that God was the sole agent of scientific change, while envisioning the Earth's past as a series of logical, progressive phases intended to advance the plan of the Creator. In 1860, however, uniformitarians relegated planetary processes to mechanistic, secondary laws moving towards ends unperceived and perhaps non-existent, thus eliminating fate, teleology, and historical narrative from discourses of the Earth's past. In the poems, the winters are so short, glee the great storm is over, and like rain it sounded till it curbed, Dickinson navigates the disillusion conditioned by this 1860 paradigm shift from theocentric to naturalistic perceptions of history. In each of these poems, Dickinson retells disproven stories of the biblical or geological flood, only to conclude by rejecting the deluge as a legend now from the perspective of her contemporary scientific culture. In keeping with uniformitarians' insistence that the present is key to the past, these poems link accounts of former diluvial catastrophes to contemporary processes such as storms and seasons, depicting an environment characterized by predictable, localized changes that appear incompatible with catastrophist insistence upon sudden, spontaneous planetary upheavals. With this structural and thematic pattern, Dickinson undermines diluvial theory in terms that mimic Lyell's argument against the geological flood. Each poem concludes by privileging nature's empirical realities over human-authored legends of biblical disasters bearing no comparison to contemporary processes. Through these gestures, Dickinson registers the historical trajectory of the catastrophist uniformitarian debate while confronting the spiritual and imaginative void conditioned by uniformitarians' purely mechanistic view of the environmental past, present, and future. In keeping with uniformitarians' challenges to historical narrative, these poems confront the question of how to tell the story of the Earth's past according to a uniformitarian worldview in which time has no direction and events have no meaning, while voicing nostalgia for biblical and catastrophist narratives that justified the course of planetary history. In the third and final group of poems that I examine, Dickinson leverages the flood to navigate post-Darwinian doubt in the biblical doctrines of resurrection and immortality. After all, the 1860 Darwinian Revolution not only challenged Old Testament history, it also undermined New Testament eschatology and futurity, leading many thinkers to point out the difficulties for a belief in immortality entailed by a belief in our gradual evolution from lower species. Though countless scholars have observed that Dickinson referred to immortality as the flood subject, few have addressed the question of why she enlists the deluge, in particular, to articulate skepticism towards the Christian afterlife. After all, if we interpret the phrase flood in a literal sense, it bears little to no meaningful relation to the subject of immortality. Yet when we interpret Dickinson's flood as a vortex metaphor linked to the 1860 scientific revolution, the phrase organizes and abbreviates the historical context responsible for Dickinson's skepticism towards the afterlife, while encoding her doubt in immortality is a symptom of scientifically informed religious uncertainty. Turning to key poems and letters, I suggest that Dickinson conflates the flood with immortality on two interrelated registers, one scientific, the other typological. By aligning the afterlife with the disproven flood, Dickinson frames the subject of immortality as a biblical casualty of the 1860 paradigm shift from religious to irreligious science, much like the deluge that uniformitarians invalidated at the outset of her poetic career. Simultaneously, she adheres to the typological connection between the Old Testament flood and the New Testament resurrection, when the mortal will put on immortality at Christ's second coming. By revisiting this biblical analogy in the aftermath of catastrophism's collapse, Dickinson constructs a post-Darwinian typology of doubt, repurposing the type-antitype connection between the flood and the resurrection to undermine New Testament eschatology. Across these works, she situates immortality alongside the flood to extend scientifically informed doubt from the Old Testament past into the New Testament future, reappraising the Christian afterlife through the prism of a disproven deluge. Okay, so that was an excerpt, like I said, from the first chapter of my dissertation. And in addition to that historical context, it places Dickinson's flood poems in conversation with the Anthropocene studies and some of the emphasis on geology that has come out of that. But for context, so the working title of the entire dissertation is Water in the Theological History of Science. And there are 3 chapters devoted to Emerson, Dickinson, and Whitman, each looking at discourses of planetary water arising at the intersections of geology and theology. So this was the first one. This Dickinson chapter was the first one I have written. I started this chapter in April 2025 after finishing my prospectus. And I received the Dickinson Award that same month, right before the semester ended. So that provided summer funding to focus exclusively on my dissertation during my time off from teaching. So during that time, I was able to conduct the research and writing necessary to complete this chapter by the end of this past semester. Whereas the summer would usually be divided between that and non-academic work. So that was really major in terms of getting the work done. I also, with the fellowship, was able to participate remotely in the 2025 Dickinson Critical Institute in June. So there I workshopped and received feedback on an early draft of this paper, and that proved absolutely instrumental to moving forward, especially at the very beginning of the project. So overall, this has helped me, this graduate award has helped me make timely progress, not only towards finishing my first chapter and holding that meeting, but also towards completing the dissertation as a whole on a timely basis and helping me stay on my chapter by chapter deadlines, moving forward. So I'm really grateful.
Thank you so much, Beverley. That's such a wonderful, amazing a project that you're working on. And thank you so much for sharing your work with us. So I'll turn it over to questions for our 2 speakers. So you can put a question in the chat, or you can unmute to ask a question. So whenever you're ready. So Emily.
Well, first of all, thank you both. And I'd like to urge both of you to submit a proposal for the American Literature Association meeting in May. The call just went out yesterday, and you might have already received it, but both of your projects fall squarely in the call. So, and that rhymed, Vladislav. So thank you for that. And I look forward to hearing more.
Brilliant. Any other questions? Eliza, great to see you, Eliza.
It's great to see you too, Per. Forgive me, everyone. I have a bad cold. Is it Vladislav? It's like how. Yes, okay. So for Vladislav, I find this really fascinating. It's also like if you don't have some kind of data crunching machine, it sounds like it's just incredibly like work that's going to take a huge amount of time. So to map out something systematic. So there are just so many things, but I don't even want to think about that stuff. What I'm wondering is, given that Dickinson is, I know, I'm sorry, but I've worked on poetry for for 30 years, and not just Dickinson, but Whittier, Longfellow. I've written on all of them. So I'm pretty aware of the pronunciation differences and the use of off rhyme and the conventional uses of off rhyme and when people are pushing things farther and things like that. But I'm wondering, so I'm wondering what the difference is. I agree with you. It makes a big difference. It's not a difference. It's going to be hard to get contemporary scholars to care. But what is the difference you find now that you are aware when you're reading and interpreting Dickinson's poems? She does use unusual, she pushes off rhyme in unusual ways. I hope you'd agree with that. You agree with that, right? But you're showing that no, not always. Some things are more conventional, and some things seem like off rhymes that aren't. For example, I'm just focusing on that one thing. Or the spellings are also really interesting. And I agree with you about Miller. She should be using Dickinson's orthography because we never know. But what difference in your understanding of Dickinson on a conceptual level has this provided? A conceptual level in terms of what she's actually doing.
The terms I came to in the end is that I have a more deeper feeling of yourself as working with the tradition rather than against it in many terms, because also the phenomenon of sound and the effects of sound, the effects of pronunciation, of differences, subtleties of pronunciation, and Emily Dickinson worked with subtleties. The first impressions that I developed, and especially studying comparatively other authors, rhyme-wise, prosody-wise, and putting certain parallelism between their works and her works, and trying to indeed add more corpus analysis, although I had to do it manually, of collecting rhymes, of reading poems by different authors, also not only Emily Dickinson, and analyzing. Through close reading, I try to achieve distant reading by indeed achieving this level of trying to compare as much as possible in order to have a more statistically more relevant picture, rather than trying to take, for example, 10% of Emily Dickinson's rhymes or poems and prosody she used, and how it could have represented her pronunciation, or how pronunciation made her develop these rhymes, without analyzing the rest of poems and without comparing with other authors. Indeed, it seemed to me practically futile, because just cherry picking results. Indeed, we can have totally different impressions of Emily Dickinson because we have also very much conventional poems on her behalf, and other poems she pushed the limits for different reasons. And what these sound studies allowed me to understand and to see is that she worked with her tradition. She didn't try to go against it, rebel against it, but she worked with it. Probably some of her rhymes, which she already did not pronounce.
Yeah, I've got it.
She just tried to copy it to represent a different register of poetry in her poem, like more antiquated one. For example, trying to copy more older rhymes from Shakespeare.
Yeah. So you said a bunch of stuff there, and that's interesting. So one is that she's cueing. Her allusions are partially oral.
Yes.
Right. So she's alluding to other texts orally.
Yes. Orally. This would be, yes, indeed. Another impression.
And that's keying people orally.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that so that is along the lines of what Miller has been arguing for a long time against the manuscript, the people who are obsessed with Dickinson's manuscripts, that there's a
debate of the visuality and orality. Yes.
Yes, yeah. So so that I think that's really interesting, and that's one very interesting outcome of your work. So Um, and it's good that you're not just looking at the big pronunciation picture, but also at the ways she's using it selectively in different ways to communicate particular ideas. So that
yeah, because this is one thing that I wanted very much to include, for example, even in today's presentation, to speak about this multiplicity and her variation. Because, for example, she could have even developed her style, changed it throughout the years. We should not analyze her like the same person, stagnant in her development from when she was little and to the way she wrote even later, because the language changes and she changes. So indeed, yes, I very much agree with you about this effect of multiplicity and taking into account different aspects.
That's great. Yeah, it's part of her toolkit to try to play with to communicate various ideas in her poems. So that's wonderful. And she has a self-awareness of it. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Karen? Oh, that's not Karen.
It's almost Karen.
Benigno. Sorry, you confused me. Sorry.
I'm also here, but Benigno wanted to ask.
Benigno, sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
that's Karen's husband.
So one of the things that strikes me as absolutely fabulous, particularly with the linguistic attention to the sounds, is that the museum takes on the future of Emily Dickinson, not just interpretation, but actually the actual sound of the corpus. This is a very important contribution to performance studies. It is something that whoever is trying to, again, bring alive the poetry of someone who's, like we all do, write in the language that continues to evolve. We have to figure out how to mediate the evolution of the language, the findings of the poetry, and the way that the poetry has to remain flexible, almost phonetically somehow. So I imagine, and again, I miss the 4 areas of concerns for the awards. There was some concern with scholarship. There's some concern with art. I don't remember whether we heard concern for. Well, we're always concerned about adaptation of Emily Dickinson's work, and adaptation of Emily Dickinson's work, and the actual adaptation of her language, or the actual access to the sound of the poetry. It's absolutely essential, and Vladislav's work points to that. So in terms of what's happening with the fight between the paradigms, what I was reminded of very vividly is this war of fundamentalisms. There's a war of fundamentalisms. Both.
Are you turning now, Benigno, to Beverley?
Yes. I'm sorry. There's a war of fundamentalisms that actually people are saying, no, this is what's happening. The old paradigm doesn't work. The new paradigm has taken over. But the new paradigm is coming. The new paradigm is coming with a necessarily intense level of fundamentalism as well. It is scientific. It's variable for the scientists, but it's less variable for the people who are hanging on to what the scientists are saying in a fundamentalist way, one-to-one meaning. The poet is always on the side of multi-meaning. The poet is always on the flexibility of the signified and the signifier relationship. So it's not surprising that she's going to be slippery. Hopefully she's not ever going to be tagged to an old paradigm or a new paradigm. And I think she makes a lot of fire and interesting things when she rebels against a one-to-one correspondence of the meaning. So I'm very grateful for these two pieces that bring a lot of things that are quite important. But and I don't ever want to make up my mind about which mid-century commitment to meaning it's ultimately right or worth dethroning. And I'm always going to be looking for the way that the poet stays nimble and stays, I think, faithful to the resonances. More than in any way interested in settling the accounts between the fighting paradigms. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to what comes out of this. And I'm looking forward to see what the museum continues to do with this issue. The EDIS and the museum both continue to do with the future of performing Emily Dickinson for now.
Beverly, do you want to respond to the paradigm shift issue that Benigno raised? Because you didn't have time to talk through a poem. I kind of wish I could ask you to do that now, but that's kind of too much to ambush someone with. But
Right.
do you want to talk about your how you're thinking about the paradigm shift and how Dickinson is the fluidity is Dickinson? Does she have the fluid kind of multivalent understanding of this paradigm shift, and how does your own critical approach relate to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so you mentioned staying nimble, and I think that's definitely part of it. That exactly like you said, she stays fluid, and that in some of these poems, well, in all of them, she's still taking typology and she's taking all these this biblical iconography and things like that. And it's not necessarily a matter of whether or not she believes anymore, but more a matter of how this forces her to reconfigure this kind of network of relations and meanings, in response to the kind of destabilizing of one element of that being the flood, that then she has to reconfigure everything else. And so, yeah, and the poems that I look at are more on the doubt side, but there are definitely other ones that, are also within that general wheelhouse of the flood poems that are more positive and more about, belief as well. And, some of them have exactly that, what James McIntosh calls that kind of vacillation between where it all happens on the same page. So, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Any other questions, comments? Emily.
It was the word vacillation, Beverly, that made my mind jump to the faith is a peerless bridge, I think it is. And the last line that indicates that if we knew what was on the other side and could be certain of it, it would cease to be to our vacillating feet a first necessity. That tangle of faith and doubt. In the course of my own research, I looked at a lot of biblical aids that were available in Dickinson's time. And one that I found very interesting is the Hitchcock Bible. And there's one at the Dickinson Museum that takes all of the verses of the Bible and organizes them by subject and how they speak to a particular subject. And as I understand it, it was quite a common thing in Protestant homes. It went through the text went through multiple iterations and was published several times over the 19th century. and even found its way into my great-grandmother's collection. But that shift is evident in the ways in which study Bibles and study texts were made available. And it reminds me, in some ways, they're organized differently, of the way the Talmud has a text and then this circle, this expanding circumference of interpretation that sit within these rings of commentary, and they're printed on the page in that way, rather than you can look at this person and here's a footnote to that person and so forth. So you really, for me, stimulated a notion of reading Dickinson in that liminal space of faith and doubt, of scientific proof versus the proof of Bible text. So I'm intrigued to see where that goes.
This is Beverly. Did you know about this Bible?
I didn't. So it's a study Bible by Hitchcock. That's great to know about. And you said it was in the family library?
It's not Edward Hitchcock.
Okay.
Okay, it's another Hitchcock. And the Bible that is on the shelf in the museum is one that I think the publication date is very close to when the family acquired it. And I can't remember whether it's been digitized at the Houghton. I'm happy to go pull it off the shelf, but it's a pretty heavy book.
Can you send her the citation?
Yeah,
I can send you that. I think I have your email.
Perfect. Yes, I would definitely, because that sounds like a great resource. So I'm really glad to hear about that. Thank you.
George.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry for having my screen off. I came down with a cold last night and I'm not feeling so well. But I loved hearing both the talks. It makes me feel good about the state of Dickinson scholarship always when I come to these things and hear exciting things that people are doing. And I have a question for Vladislav, which is having grown up in Eastern Massachusetts and gone away and then come back and sort of like I'm more aware of the accents than I was when I grew up there. Your thesis seems to me to really hold water, but I'm wondering about two aspects, and you may have talked about this early on because I was late arriving, but one is regional differences, like sub-regional differences between, say, Eastern Massachusetts and Western Massachusetts, given that there was sort of like less of a kind of transportation network and less sort of back and forth, maybe. And then, the other is if we can know how the Massachusetts accent has changed over the centuries at this point, really, but given sort of successive waves of immigration and so on. And I just wonder if you've, kind of thought about that and if that's a factor in what you're arguing.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. Indeed, this is one of the these are the spot on questions, actually, because yes, both phenomena would definitely impacted how I research and what I research, because there are sub-regional differences. Apparently, there were at any given time, and there are, and they develop chronologically, diachronically. So that is a great problem. And for this reason, yes, I needed to also be very specific about if I want to try to attribute one kind of pronunciation to Emily Dickinson, when I should start looking for it. And for this reason, for example, at the beginning of my research, I just focused on, let's say, 1830s, 1850s, and what were common pronunciations, very much plural, 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 at that period of time, more generally in New England, and then trying to narrow down as far as I could, taking out single vowel, single consonant, find more precise, more specific, more local explanations, examples of different accents, different dialects, different pronunciations that I could narrow down up to Amherst. And because, for example, yes, of course, we have, for example, Webster's Dictionary and the developments, the publications of Webster's Dictionary by his son-in-law after his death in the 1830s. So we have practically different authors that professed different standards for language, because Webster, a person of the 18th century, actually developed and professed the standard in Amherst too, of his own and of his own time. But the language also developed parallelly in its own way with other pronunciation due to migrations, due to arrival, as I liked very much to include in my PhD, the example, for example, how Amherst College contained more than half of students from other areas of the United States. And in essence, we cannot speak about New England dialect, for example, without considering influences from people from Virginia studying there, or from Ohio, etc., from different areas of New England. It's just a big melting pot, and this I needed to do so chronologically. And what I chose in the end is to believe, and especially with what represented in rhymes by Emily Dickinson in other areas, that she most likely copied the majority of pronunciation patterns of your parents and of your grandparents. And we can imagine that since she was also later socially more reclusive, the impact of these foreign external linguistic changes, influences from other people, from speaking with other people, were not so influential as to other more social creatures, like, for example, Susan and Austin Dickinson, who mingled with more people than Emily Dickinson theoretically did. And so I preferred to, chronologically, to study more older languages, and indeed I found more patterns representative of this New England, let's say, Western Massachusetts pronunciations before the Civil War, because after the Civil War, also this great technological and industrial and logistical development and the introduction of railways obviously brought people to migrate and change the linguistic landscape too. But I also, and anyway, speaking strictly about the geography, the questions of Eastern Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts, there are a lot of debates, but here of trying to generalize something. But in my opinion, and what I found in examples from Dickinson, for other poets, for other people, and from other opinions of linguists and philologists of that time, anyway, any particular region had a proportional majority, but still had different kinds of dialects, accents, and pronunciations. So yes, in New England, you could have expected 2 or 3 most common pronunciations for a sound O, for example. But in other areas, you had several pronunciations. And yes, you need to study to choose which one seemed most likely for one particular person, because just another neighbor living just beside Dickinson could have spoken in a different manner for different reasons. So these are very good questions. And for this reason, yeah, but when possible, I try to include this multiplicity and explain this multiplicity, because I also believe Emily Dickinson could have shifted from even different registers. From she was quite knowledgeable anyway about different pronunciations, and she wrote down several colloquialisms by her father, for example, saying it's amazing raw. So she could have shifted herself for different reasons in her poetry, in her letters, being a bit more comic here and using some more vernacular colloquialisms, and have a higher language, a higher pronunciation in other circumstances. And you need to consider these different plurals in one, because indeed, as I told Liza too, we can also expect Dickinson changing in years and changing her pronunciation patterns. So I think it's important to be open to this multiplicity and consider different circumstances.
Okay, brilliant. So Emily's question.
That leads me to wonder about about code switching in the region, and you talked about migration and look, if we think of the Irish servants that the family had, and then the African American community in that area, and the nature of code switching, which is I don't think has been as thoroughly dealt with. Eliza, correct me if I'm wrong, in the 19th century, though it is very much there, particularly in the writings that attempt to record dialectical changes and the local color movement of the later period. To what extent would it sounds like Dickinson was well aware of the kind of code switching that would occur when one was speaking with a working class individual, or someone who had an Irish lilt, or the ways in which there were certain expectations, more so in the South than I think in Massachusetts, of a type of speaking, a dialect that was expected of African Americans. And Biagio mentioned performance, and Gerard, you've done a lot of work with musical settings and are aware of the ways in which composers, sometimes in setting Dickinson's words, find a kind of conflict between the pronunciation and the musical inflection that comes there. And I'm thinking about Leo Smith's setting of They Shut Me Up in Prose, which ended up with, instead of content, ended up with content. And it might not be They Shut Me Up in Prose, but I remember that particular one. There was it ended up being inflected in a way that didn't necessarily reflect the word. So it opens up a lot of interesting possibilities, I think.
Yeah, if I may say, just to add, indeed, this is what, in the end, my PhD thesis finished with these multiple possibilities of further study, which anyway requires to at least to understand the level of pronunciation and what variations existed for which reasons. So this sociolinguistic level of the language and also literary language, prosody language, so poetic conventions and ideas about how practically words and their sounds can be played with when performing. So indeed, this opens up big area of research in prosody, because, for example, I make an example of the word heaven, which by some scholars has been recently suggested, or not suggested, mentioned, to the word to be pronounced in 2 syllables, heaven, which is common today. But when we study the pronunciation, let's say the rules of pronunciations of Dickinson's time, we discovered that no, the standard pronunciation was heaven with one syllable, omitting the second syllable. And for the most part, this pronunciation heaven with two syllables signified a performative pronunciation rather than the normal colloquial one. So the same goes for Emily Dickinson. When we approach the word in her case, it makes more sense to feel her fluidity and adapt with the syllabic heaven to the rhythm of the poem. But when we find, for example, having only one syllable for a pronunciation, we should not consider it as an archaism or specifically poetic kind of pronunciation, but rather something more or less normal that she just deployed probably without thinking too much in her poem. And so it's also absolutely normal prosody. Speaking of the prosody, it's normal for her to use or this or that variant. So we have two standard pronunciations, which also variated in different contexts for performance, not performance, and what I also would advise to you, which is very interesting, is what I took a great pleasure in while researching, is to study and to search for linguistic comments in magazines, journals, and various publications where they put a lot of anecdotes of someone, for example, complaining that some church chorus used a certain rhyme which was completely off, but they sang it making a full rhyme. Well, they should not have do that because the word didn't pronounce in this way. And so for Emily Dickinson, indeed, going deeper like that, and word by word, it can be very interesting to see these new developments, as you said, in other studies.
Brilliant. Eliza's got another question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I want to make sure that I'd like to know what both of the speakers think of one another's work. And if you have anything to say to one another about what you learned today from one another, and whether you can imagine an impact on your work from one another.
Can I just add to that? One of the things, and this is maybe just echoing Benigno, but one of the things that I just heard so strongly in both papers is about what it means to be writing and reading across change in knowledge and dialect, and that I think both of them are just very rich meditations on both our own surety as 21st century readers of what it is that we know, but also of this sense of tumultuousness and multiplicity of speech and belief in 19th century Amherst.
Beverley, do you have a thought?
Yes, it's Vladislav, right? Yeah, I thought yours was fascinating and definitely, as Eliza was saying, relevant to thinking about how she uses words, looking at the flood as a vortex word. So I thought that was really interesting. And you talked about, how, like, looking at her misspellings. I was wondering also if, and I don't know if this is a thing, but in her letters, sometimes she'll like punctuate things. Like there's one letter to Susan Gilbert where she uses an apostrophe before an S when it would just be it's usually. So I was wondering if that's something you look at kind of in conjunction with that, or.
Yeah, that's something I definitely noticed, because reading and rereading, as everyone might know, you start to see patterns, And obviously here, also speaking of punctuation, I see the let's say reading her poems, let's say more her letters, her prose, in conjunction with others' writings, for example, of her family's manuscripts. Yeah, you notice that some called it also laziness of not using or using punctuation in one way or another when it is not actually necessary. When she doesn't use, although it can be very much necessary to divide something. You notice the same patterns in others' writings, in others' texts, in other manuscripts. And yes, you understand that, for example, like today, I suppose, at some point in the US, most probably it's more common to use dashes than in the UK, as I noticed from my personal experience. And for example, here, this is the same thing. Yeah, you start noticing that your dashes are not so radical, actually, if you put them in the context that other women in her family, yes, tended to use the dashes or long form dashes for whichever reason they wanted. And so it seems pretty normal in this context.
Vladislav, do you have thoughts for Beverley?
Yes, because indeed, absolutely, Karen said the same thing what I wanted to say, that Beverley, yeah, her work made me also think and consider, I suppose, being more also considerate at this semantic level of words, especially of this conflicting nature of the position of religion in Emily Dickinson's life, but also in the society, and actually how it developed and how it might have developed through her language. So, because indeed, in researching deeply, yeah, I suppose I will, thanks to Beverley, indeed, I will be also very careful trying to, if drawn, for example, examples from your religious talk or religious vocabulary. Indeed, one should be also very much attentive to the signified part of what it meant for Emily Dickinson at that period of time, at that period of her life, and having these biographical connotations and probably the streams of different thoughts that she might have developed, even speaking in the same manner, but in different contexts. And so, yeah, thanks very much for also opening this good conflict between her relationship with religion, her relationship with science, which were obviously colliding always, but also it is very true that they collided and conflicted in different ways in different time. So that was great. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. So we've kind of moving to the end of our oh, sorry.
Elizabeth had her hand up.
Oh, sorry, Elizabeth.
That's okay, Park. I wanted to thank both of you for these wonderful talks. They're just, I think, an extraordinary example of what the fellowships can do in terms of how it can bring to the fore the scholarship that people are doing. And we want to make sure that people remember that we are launching the Fellowship Awards. I can't say enough, really. I think just Vlad, you answered one of my questions which was going to be about the promise for the digital archive of sound recordings that you're developing. So thank you for that. And Beverley, it was wonderful to hear how subtle you were about describing the evolution of Dickinson's response to what Benigno, was calling this war of fundamentalisms, and the way that she really responds to those different currents in both natural science and theological doctrine. And particularly, I would love in some future time to hear you talking about the different registers in which Dickinson refers to the language of water, deluge, flood, brook, stream, freshet. They're words that probably some of them kind of, carrying different meanings, and I'm sure you have a sense of that. I did, though, just wanted to come back to the fellowships and remind everyone of that we have examples of all of their work on the EDIS website, on the arts page, the fellowship page. Please look for their work there and be in touch. And also, we are launching those two fellowships today, both for the undergraduate scholarship. Due date is June 30th of 2026. And then the graduate student fellowships, those applications will be due on March 15th. And again, we're happy to take comments and questions. So thank you for posting that. That's wonderful, Park. If you do have questions about them, feel free to send me an email, and we're happy to answer any questions you have. So thank you all so very much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Elizabeth, and your awards committee for selecting two such wonderful recipients of our fellowships. It was a joy to listen to both of the papers. Thank you, Beverley. Thank you, Vladislav. And thank you, everyone, for such wonderful questions. This has been recorded, so hopefully it will be on our YouTube channel soon. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you, Park. Thanks, everybody.